Welcome, friends. And first of all, as always, thanks to John Lee Hooker, Carlos Santana, for reminding us about change that's coming. This is Economic Update, a program brought to you every week by the Pacifica Network. Our purpose is to analyze major economic events and trends, the forces shaping our jobs, incomes, taxes, debts, what we buy and what we pay for the goods and services on which we all depend. I am your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my life at several universities. Currently, I am a visiting professor in the graduate program for international affairs of the New School University in New York City. I also write columns of economic analysis for the website truthout.org, a courageous source of independent news, news analysis, and commentary daily. Please keep sending in your questions and comments. We read each one and select the few we can respond to on the air, but we also use them to shape the programs and the content of our programs. Send them, as always, please, to democracyatwork.info, a website that you will find interesting and that also brings your communications to me. Today, I'm very proud to say we'll be talking about economics and ecology, the whole environmental question that surges periodically and is always around us. So let me now welcome to the program and introduce Victor Wallace. Victor, I'm glad you were able to join us today.
Thank you, Rick.
Victor Wallace teaches in the Liberal Arts Department at the Berklee College of Music, located in Boston. He's also the managing editor of a journal called Socialism and Democracy, which appears 3 times a year. If you're interested in pursuing it, you can find it online at sdonline.org, sdonline.org. He has written extensively on political ecology, on questions of the environment. His articles have appeared in Monthly Review, Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, and Organization and Environment. His work has been internationally recognized and translated, at latest count, into 9 languages. So, Victor, we're going to talk about the environment. We're going to talk about the economic relationship between the issues of the environment. So let's start. With so much that we hear, pro and con, up and down, as someone who watches this closely, could you tell us, in your own words, what you think the situation of our environment is now? How are we interacting as a human species with the physical environment around us, and how would you account for the condition you're about to describe?
The most striking thing to me, and I think that what we most need to think about, is how little any of what can be said about this is generally recognized by the public in the United States. I mean, we've just been through 2 weeks of international discussions on this issue in Durban, South Africa, and the coverage in the U.S. media has been virtually negligible. Now, the basic problems are well known to anybody who follows this, scientists and so on. It's not just climate change, it's all kinds of disruption. I mean, it's the putting of excess carbon into the air, which is the clearest single change, has so many effects. In addition to all the extreme weather effects, it changes the composition of the oceans, the acidification of the oceans, which leads to the death of coral and to endangering lots of fish species. But apart from all the carbon effects and the weather effects from that, there's also the continuing destruction of habitat, the putting of toxins into the air, affecting agricultural land with genetically modified organisms, radiation from all kinds of sources, not just the famous nuclear thing, but all these high-tech means of communication, all kinds of things that are not usually taken into account. I mean, we just hear of the greenhouse gases and so on, but it's every dimension that's being affected, and the species loss and so on. So all this is well known. I don't claim to be a particular expert on actually describing this, but it's well known, and it's universally recognized by scientists. What's extraordinary is the amount of space and attention that's given in this country to people who pretend that all this is not happening. And that's what most preoccupies me, and which I think we all really need to think about how to respond to that situation.
So if I understand you, then you're saying that there's an accumulation over many years of a vast array of scientific information suggesting that we are damaging our environment in ways that is dangerous for us, even in terms of our survival.
Absolutely.
So tell me, if you can, why is that so little known? Why have those who have pretended to be critics of all of this, pretended that there's contradictory evidence, why have they done what they've done, and why have they been so successful?
Well, they've done what they've done. It's pretty transparent. I mean, ExxonMobil and the Chambers of Commerce and so on, who are front and center of this denialism, they don't want to interfere with the process of growth and accumulation of the capitalist economy. That's clear and straightforward. The ironic thing is that even those who claim to recognize that there's a problem don't challenge that assumption that it's desirable to continue to grow and have profit. So even those who recognize that there's a problem still give credence by giving attention to these people who deny it. So I mean, papers like the New York Times, for example, which is emblematic of this kind of thing, they'll describe all this stuff as though, well, this is just part of the debate. And ironically, even a little bit of the culture that's arisen in the universities around multiculturalism and diversity and so on has come as a kind of justification of not cutting off any point of view. So even a point of view that flies in the face of science is accorded some kind of credibility, just as the way it is in those who deny evolution and so on. So that the denial of the environmental crisis is seen at least as a position that deserves to be given attention, whereas it shouldn't be. It should be excluded. I mean, the discussion. There's so much that needs to be discussed about how actually to handle the crisis, that to get distracted with people who don't even recognize that it exists is a real disservice.
So your basic argument, though, I just want to pull it out so we can say it, is that the major thrust, if I've understood you correctly, the major thrust in the denialism, as you call it, comes from corporations, business enterprises, who see this kind of scientific evidence mounting about environmental degradation as risking their profitability, and so it pays them to spend money to hire PR firms and buy scientists and so on to create a fuzziness and a debate so they don't have to deal with the problem. Am I reading you right?
That's correct, and they've had an amazing amount of success because according to surveys, in the last few years, the number of people in this country who recognize the gravity of the crisis has actually declined.
Yeah, it's remarkable. Okay, tell me what is being done. I do understand, and particularly I'd appreciate your attention to this, that there are those who believe that we are capable of, and indeed maybe moving toward, a new kind of capitalist system in the United States, which they call, quote-unquote, green capitalism. In other words, that we are moving away from bread made with wheat that has been treated with pesticides and everything else, and more towards organic wheat, and that we find in our supermarkets an organic section, that there's some kind of transition underway. Could you say something about what this green capitalism is, how far it's gone, what its potential is, and how you see that?
Well, the particular examples that you refer to are what I would call a kind of niche market. I mean, obviously the market will respond in certain limited ways if there are some people who are looking for new alternatives. But what this doesn't do is stop the process of oil exploration, for example, and more generally, it doesn't stop the process of economic growth and the continued orientation towards that on the part of the government, that everything is geared toward that. So the so-called green capitalism still doesn't question the idea that unlimited growth and perpetual growth is desirable. And they put the issue exclusively in terms of a question of what forms of energy are used, and not in terms of the total amount of productive, extractive, and so on activity, the amount of space used up, the amount of depletion of the aquifers, the amount of destruction of the forests, and so on. So that there's a tremendous kind of disconnect. There's a sense that we could have just as much energy and even more by using these alternative forms of energy, each of which has physical limitations that, there's not time to go into it here, but every type of energy that you can imagine, whether it's limitations of space or whatever, or dangers in the case of geothermal of provoking seismic reactions and so on. So there are limitations. So whatever one thinks of in terms of alternative energies, and I don't deny that it's important to think of that, what is overlooked is the need to cut back on the total amount of energy used, which in turn implies the need to reorganize the sum total of production and consumption activities, and which I would say in turn requires us to think critically, both locally, nationally, and internationally, to think critically about what sectors of activity should be curtailed, drastically cut back, and so on. And this is what I've found most missing for years and years in all the discussions at every level, certainly at the international level, where they talk about what nations should cut, but what nations should limit themselves, and so on. But they don't talk about the sectors within the countries that don't serve human need, but that instead serve the perpetuation of the system.
I think that one way to get at that is, in my experience, people have learned to think that if there isn't economic growth and expansion, then their jobs are threatened, that their job in a capitalist system requires the company to keep producing more and more of whatever it is that they help to make, and that anything less or other than that isn't a threat. And therefore you can enlist the mass of working people in the goals of a company to get a bigger market share, to grow. Whereas the alternative idea that you're, I think, speaking to has to do with the notion that there could be jobs in moving a society from a dangerous environmental situation to a much safer one, and that lots of jobs exist there, and you might think not only in terms of do I have a job or not, depending on what I'm producing now, but rather you could begin to think about, could I have a different job from the one I have now, doing something a lot more positive for the human race than what I'm doing now? How does that fit with what you were saying?
Very much so, although I would say also that in part there's a question of interrogating the whole idea of a job as opposed to a function that needs to be carried out in the society. Because one of the things, if you move away from capitalist agriculture towards a more sustainable agriculture that doesn't deplete the water supply, for example, is that more people would be involved in the agriculture, but not necessarily as a full-time thing. So they would be producing some of their own needs, but thereby have less need of being in the market economy and the wage labor kind of situation. So the whole situation of job, or the concept of job, is associated with wage labor, which is itself one of the problems that we have to surmount or go beyond it.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's a wonderful transition for us. How often a basic question like the environment and our relationship to it, and so many other questions, get trapped in the assumption that everything in the future we can think of has to look like what we have in the present. Right. It's sort of, we hope for a better future, but it's very hard for us to carry that hope through. We're not limited by a capitalist system because you could organize the economy in a different way, and it would have different rules about what you do during the day as your job and how you get money to live and so forth. And so it's a perfect transition. You're the editor of a socialist journal, Socialism and Democracy. So tell me how you would define and develop what a socialist response would be to the environmental crisis of our time, and how it would be different from the capitalist one we've been discussing.
Yeah. Well, you start off with the idea that's encompassed in the slogan, people before profits. I would add people and nature before profits. People and nature mutually dependent. You can't have the people can't survive without nature being respected in certain ways. So, I mean, the basic idea with socialism is that decisions about what to produce and how much to produce and so on are not made on the basis of whether profit can be made from it, but rather on the basis of social criteria which are publicly discussed. In other words, that you have an accountable process. And as such, it's not oriented towards accumulation, but rather towards satisfying need. And what level of need has to be satisfied or can be satisfied is something that has to be arrived at on the basis of sort of the fullest possible knowledge and the fullest possible involvement in public discussion. But I would say that the outcome of such deliberation is one in which the society can actually decide whether or not to increase economic activity in any particular area. It's not wedded, as you are under capitalism, to growth. It can reduce, and I would say again, reduce not just understood in an aggregate way and not just understood in a way of belt-tightening, but reduce in the sense of cutting back certain spheres of activity which don't serve the general interest. For example, military activity, activity in the whole financial sector of the economy, activity associated with advertising, activity associated with the organization of transit and the organization of residential location, all of which have implications for the environment and which, if you can get away from the profit orientation, are all subject to reconfiguration, to redesigning communities, removing private cars from certain areas, reducing the total number of private cars, and so on. So all these kinds of things can be done if you have a socially or publicly oriented process, and they can't be done under capitalism. Now, of course, we're talking ultimately about an entire system, but in the meantime, we have to think about doing this directly, establishing certain spheres of activity in which we can begin to put this into practice, both to start achieving some of our goals, but also to educate by example as to the things that are possible.
Victor, let me interject. It's always struck me in discussions of socialism and capitalism and as alternatives and so forth, that in a society that commits itself, or at least says so, to democracy, to the notion that people affected by decisions have therefore the right to participate in making them because they have to live with the results, that if it's true, as you point out and others like you point out, that the decisions of corporations to use a particular kind of technology or to expand their businesses have environmental effects, that those decisions change the air quality we all breathe and the water that we all depend on, and emit into the atmosphere things that affect the sunlight we do or do not get, etc., that then if we all live with the consequences, then there is something fundamentally undemocratic in allowing a small number of people in charge of the small number of large corporations who have to make money, because that's their definition of their job, and make profits, which is what they're paid to do. They're going to be making decisions that we all have to live with or die from without our participation. Isn't it kind of on the surface an undemocratic arrangement that you are opposing? I mean, am I misreading you?
No, exactly. That's exactly the point. I mean, the corporation or the capitalist enterprise is, in structural or political terms, a dictatorship. Those who run it are not accountable to those who work for it or to those who live in the communities affected by it. So that puts into question the whole claim of the society to be run democratically. Capitalism itself is not a democratic system. It was not introduced through any kind of democratic process. It was established as a fait accompli by those who were the capitalists themselves, and whatever democratic institutions have arisen within it on the basis of popular struggles against the domination of those groups. And the struggle has to go much further than it's gone before, because we're seeing the limits of even of the possibility of continuing life being reached as a result of the continuation of this decision-making process.
Let me take you now to what probably is the big question. If you're right, if the environmental crisis is at a very extreme point already in threatening ourselves, our generation, children, and so on, How can this be understood? How can we overcome what you earlier called the denialism that has been fostered by the agencies you've described? Do you have any thoughts about how the situation could be changed in terms of the consciousness of the mass of the, for example, the American people, and in terms of actions that they might undertake?
Well, this is a tremendous challenge to all of us. I don't really claim to have a full answer, but what I would urge everybody to do is to not only educate yourselves about this, but to make it a subject of discussion in every sphere of activity. We can use the alternative media. Some of them are already giving this kind of emphasis. I think that, for example, Democracy Now!, by actually spending a week in Durban, helped. But this kind of thing is the type of question that should be in the forefront of discussion every day, just the way we discuss, the way the present media discuss the ups and downs of the stock market. I mean, that we need to not only to pay attention to what's happening to the environment, but to be involved in a discussion in which concrete proposals are put on the table in a way that ultimately would be routine for the entire society if we had a social transformation. But we can't wait for that to address these problems now, so that the questions have to be brought to people's attention in many ways. I have been interested in the indigenous movements around the world, even though they're small in number relative to the total global population, simply in the sense that they reflect societies in which the whole popular culture is bound up with a kind of awareness of their interaction with and dependence on the natural environment. And the question of how this kind of culture really can be brought into connection with the daily culture of people living surrounded by the sort of the commercial influences and the commercial cultural influences that we deal with, so that I suppose, for example, in schools, in every sphere, in every subject that one addresses, there is an environmental dimension which needs to be brought out continuously, because we're dealing with the limits of resource, we're dealing with the conditions for continuing life. So an expression of the urgency of this in a context that is constantly before the public, and every kind of issue. I'm just thinking off the top of my head now about sports facilities, for example, where they have synthetic turf and so on, and all the toxins that go into that and the adverse effects of it, or in the context of educational activities, thinking of the buildings in which it takes place, in the building in which they take place, or of the processes people have to go through to get there, how the activities that they're engaged in could be relocated, reorganized, how people also can establish networks independent of existing structures to constantly educate themselves and spread awareness of these issues. I mean, it's inseparable, I think, from the larger issues, from the economic issues that you discuss regularly on this. But I think that since the economic issues do ultimately depend on the resources that we use and on the notion of what it is that drives the decisions, that this is an inseparable component, an inseparable dimension of the whole sphere of activity that you're discussing.
Yeah, I was thinking as I came over today to get ready for this program of an example that has occurred to me and that friends have talked to me about. Once upon a time here in the United States, all of us relied for our drinking water on turning on the tap in our home or our office or our workplace and filling a glass with water and drinking the water. Then, as a result, among other things, of environmental pollutions of all kinds, the water became a problem. It didn't taste right. It had stuff in it that it shouldn't have. We then had to dump chlorine on it, so it started tasting like we were drinking our swimming pool. And so what did we do? We shifted over so that more and more of us now go and buy plastic bottles filled with water. Of course, to produce the plastic, you need lots of petroleum. So you have to pollute the earth even more to get the petroleum out of the ground, to bring it from thousands of miles away here with smokestacks that pollute the air, so we're going to make the problems of the earth worse while we think we're solving the problem. We're trying to get out of it individually by buying a plastic bottle of water every day, when in fact having to do that and make that expenditure is a waste of our money to deal with the pollution of our planet, which is not being solved by this step, is actually being made worse. The absurdity of the interaction between environmental degradation and economics is kind of encapsulated in that story. Victor Wallace, thank you very much for coming today. I really appreciate you taking the time and trouble to join us today and bring this issue of the environment back into the front and center position it deserves.
Thank you, Rick.
Let's take our short midpoint break, and then we'll come back for the second. I want to turn to answering the question in that song we just heard, why? And I want to answer it in relationship to something of a mystery that has been unfolding and that has caused many of you to communicate it to me. And here's the way, or at least one way it could be put. We are now in a very deep and long-lasting economic crisis. After all, as I like to remind folks, the official beginning of this downturn was December of 2007. And because it has affected so many millions of people losing their jobs, so many millions losing their homes, because it's lasting so long, because people are out an average number of weeks of unemployment that is longer than any downturn we've had for decades. This crisis, therefore, has lent itself to comparison with the last major breakdown of capitalism as a system in this country. And I'm referring, of course, to the 1930s and what we now call the Great Depression, a collapse that began in October of 1929 and really didn't end until early of the year 1941. So we're talking about an 11 or 12-year crisis, lasted a very long time. If we use that as a benchmark, we're not even halfway through what it may turn out to be this time as well. But what is very striking about a difference between the 1930s and the crisis today hinges on a very peculiar phenomena. When the crisis hit in the Great Depression, the new president, a man named Franklin Roosevelt, elected in 1932, was considered a centrist, rather like President Obama is considered today. He talked about balanced budgets. He talked the kind of relatively conservative, anti-deficit, reduce the budget debts of the country, and so on. And yet, shortly after he takes power, in 1933 and 1934, the president, Roosevelt, undergoes a stunning change, and his policies undergo a stunning change. We don't hear about austerity. We don't hear about balancing the budget. We don't hear anymore in the 1930s, when Roosevelt changes, about the need to cut government employment the way we hear it today. We don't hear about the need to cut back services to people the way we hear it about it today. I want to look at that with you, and I want to analyze it. First, let's be as clear as we can with as much drama as I can muster. What did Roosevelt do in the depths of the Depression of the 1930s that is so different from what is being done now? Well, let's see. First of all, the Depression conditions were worse than they are today. For example, in 1933, the official unemployment rate was 25%. That's 3 times worse than what it officially is today. Wow. In those years, with such enormous unemployment,
There was widespread poverty and real desperation. You can imagine the condition of city, state, and the federal budget. With that many people out of work, they weren't paying taxes. That plunged the government into tremendous difficulty. They weren't bringing in the tax revenues to pay for all the things government normally did. Police department, fire department, public schools, maintaining the roads, the whole list. So you can imagine that there would have been calls, wow, if the government hasn't got this money, it's going to have to cut back. But you would have been wrong. Because what Roosevelt did in the midst of a depression, much worse than what we have so far in this one, what Roosevelt did was the opposite. I'm going to give you the three major examples of what Roosevelt did. First, he announced the establishment of an entirely new system called Social Security. We had never had that before in the United States. The president announced, in the midst of a depression, that the government was going to spend a ton of money. Doing what? Helping old people. Providing a pension to everybody 65 years of age or older who had spent a lifetime of work, either in the home or on the job or both, as a matter of their rights as citizens. Wow. And of course, one of the reasons Roosevelt did this was to help in the Depression. It meant that old people were going to get some help, not a handout of charity, not a welfare, but rather a recognition that a lifetime of labor given to this country got you in return a reasonable pension for your old age as a kind of thank you and appreciation for what you had done. But the interesting thing is he created Social Security. What is being debated in Washington today is the exact opposite, reducing Social Security payments, making you wait longer till you're 67, 8, or 9 to become eligible. So in the 30s, when the Depression was worse and government had less money coming in, they created a program, whereas today, when we're a much richer society and the Depression we have is much less severe, we're not only not increasing a Social Security system, we're cutting it. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. Roosevelt in the 30s did a second thing, also involving a huge expenditure of money at a time when the government supposedly didn't have it. He declared the establishment of an unemployment compensation system. We had never had that in the United States before either. This meant that every unemployed American who lost his or her job through no fault of their own, simply because the employer couldn't hire them anymore, since the employer couldn't sell what they helped to produce because of the economic downturn, such workers would get 1-2 years of weekly unemployment compensation payouts. And remember, you had a 25% unemployment. 1 out of 4 workers was eligible for these payments. And of course, here again, Roosevelt was helping the mass of people negatively impacted by the crisis. He helped them with a pension for their elderly, and now he was helping them with an unemployment check while they weren't working. But now the third thing that Roosevelt did. He announced the following: if the private sector, if private capitalism of the 1930s either could not or would not provide work for the tens of millions of unemployed workers who wanted jobs and were ready to work, then, said President Roosevelt, there's no alternative but for me as president to provide jobs. And between 1934 and 1941, Roosevelt created and filled 12.5 million federal jobs. He put, in other words, a huge number of the unemployed back to work, having a job, earning a decent income, able to make their mortgage payments so they could keep their homes, etc. What are we doing today? Today there is no federal employment program. Not only has President Obama not created what Roosevelt did, he hasn't even proposed it. It's not that he tried and the Republicans rejected it. Neither Republicans nor Democrats are even discussing what the last president did in a similar economic downturn, even though he's from the same political party, the Democratic Party. So we are stuck with a remarkable dichotomy and a remarkable difference. The last time capitalism breaks down, the president comes roaring in with enormous outlays of money. Whereas today, with a lesser depression, at least so far, none of our leading officials seems to be able to imagine, let alone propose, a comparable or anything like a comparable program of helping the mass of people damaged by an economic crisis they did not cause. What's going on here? Well, the answer that I want to bring to your attention may surprise you a little bit. The answer is not that in the 1930s there was belief in the leadership of the country, in the theory or the program of government intervention in an economy when capitalism breaks down. That kind of theory that the government needs and can step in is associated with a very famous British economist named John Maynard Keynes, spelled Keynes, who was the leading economist in Great Britain in the middle of the 1930s, and who looked around him at the Great Depression and came up with the fairly obvious argument that capitalism wasn't working real well, and that if you leave capitalism to its own devices, it breaks down, and sometimes in catastrophic ways, and that therefore we need to understand why that happens, and we need to tell the government how to step in to either prevent such things or at least to make them go away quickly and not hurt too many people. And he developed a theory and a program of behavior that has since come to be called either Keynesian economics or Keynesianism for short. Some people want us to believe that the advisors around President Roosevelt in the 30s were somehow suddenly converts to Keynes's theories or to Keynesian thinking, and that's why the president changed. And they like to believe that this is a superior way of understanding capitalism. It recognizes capitalism's weaknesses and flaws, and it has come up with this ducky-nice government intervention program to get us around capitalism's difficulties, to either prevent these crises from happening or to make them short and shallow rather than long and deep. I would respectfully like to disagree. I don't think President Roosevelt had a great theoretical breakthrough, and I don't think his advisors did either. I think there's a very different explanation for what happened in the 1930s that has the nice advantage of also explaining why what Roosevelt did then is so different from what Bush and Obama have done so far now. Here's the explanation. In the 1930s, when the economy fell off the wagon, when millions lost their jobs, millions lost their homes, poverty stared everybody in the face, three things happened, and they all very similar. First, we had the most profound, far-reaching labor union movement that the United States has ever seen. We never had such a thing before, and we've never had it since. In a matter of months, millions of American workers in our major industries, auto, steel, chemicals, rubber, and so on, joined unions for the first time. They were organized under something called the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. That's the same thing as later merged to become the AFL-CIO. our modern union movement. But then it was powerful. It was dynamic. It was what was happening to working people across America. And as millions joined these unions, two other things were going on that were just as important. First, a number of socialist parties that had existed and existed in important ways in many parts of the United States got much stronger. Hundreds of thousands of Americans affected by the crisis, able in a very practical, concrete way in their own personal lives to see that this was an economic system that didn't work well, had decided to join the Socialist Party, to make changes that would really do something to prevent these kinds of crises from having these kinds of devastating effects on people's lives. They joined the Socialist Party, and they began to agitate in big cities, in little towns, in schools, in churches, in neighborhoods, in sports clubs, all across American society. They began to spread their arguments about the limits, the flaws, the shortcomings of capitalism, and the advantages of a social transition to a better system for serving the major needs of the majority of people. And alongside the socialists, we also had the surge of a new and powerful communist party here in the United States, which was able to gain footholds in a number of industries, a number of parts of the United States, and to become quite influential. So we had a union movement, a socialist movement, a communist movement. Many of the people in each of these was also active in the others. That is, the CIO was the place where lots of socialists and communists did their work. And so you had an influence on the economy through the unions, on politics by so many people talking about this, and on our culture, because socialists and communists were interested in affecting how people thought about society and thought about life in general. Together, the union drives, the socialists and the communists, basically turned to the President of the United States and said, "We are mobilizing millions upon millions of people. You must do something for us in this period of capitalism's breakdown, or else you're going to force us, as well as invite us, as well as encourage us, to make our arguments that capitalism is the system of the past and socialism or communism that of the future. And we can show you by the millions of people we can get into street demonstrations, that we can get to join unions, that we can get to create socialist clubs and communist clubs that produce newspapers and magazines and you name it, that we're a political force to be contended with." And I think in the marches they ran, in the demonstrations they held, they sent an unmistakable message to the president and to the business community. You're going to have to do something, because if you don't, your whole system may not survive. Roosevelt was a smart politician. He understood what was being said to him, and he was ready to make a deal. And so here's what he did. He went to the business community, and after all, let's remember, Roosevelt came from one of the richest, oldest, best families in America. His relatives had been president before him, etc. He knew these people, and they knew him. And they all saw those demonstrations in the streets. He said to them, "I need to take care of the American people, because if we don't, we're not going to stay in our positions as capitalists much longer. Our system is broken down. We have to do massive amounts of repair, and we have to take care of the mass of people while we do so. And the only way to pay for that is for you, gentlemen," he said, "you big businesses, you top executives, you're going to have to cough up the money." And he convinced enough of them, not all of them, by the way, not by a long shot, but he convinced enough of them that he was right, that they faced a threat to capitalism as a system if they didn't act, that they went in on the deal. They would back Roosevelt. They would give him the money, huge taxes on business, huge taxes on the rich, plus lots of loans, because they didn't want to just be taxed. They preferred loans to taxes, as those folks always do. But a combination of lending to the government and paying huge taxes would give Roosevelt the money to do what? Well, I've told you, to create Social Security, to create the unemployment compensation program, and to hire 12.5 million people to do all kinds of socially useful work. Wow. Roosevelt took the promise of the business community and he went to the unions and the socialists and the communists, and he said to them, I got a deal for you. I'm going to create an enormous apparatus of programs to help unemployed and working people on a scale you've never seen before. But in exchange, you've got to shut up about going beyond capitalism. All that stuff about socialism and communism, you can talk a little bit about it, but that's got to be gone. You've got to say that this program of Social Security, unemployment compensation, and public employment is wonderful, and you've got to back me. That's the deal. I'll get that done. You've got to back me. And the unions and the socialists and the communists, in the main, bought the deal, just like most of the business community, or at least a large chunk of it, did. And that was the alliance. The quote-unquote progressive wing of the business and rich community on the one hand, and the union, socialists, and communists on the other, with a few dissenters on both sides. By the way, that's why Roosevelt was reelected 4 times, something no other president had ever achieved before. He put together an incredibly powerful combination. It wasn't Keynesian economics or a new theory from England that changed the president. It was massive pressure from below. The turn to Keynesian economics was simply the form. And beyond the form of doing this, it allowed the people in charge to flatter themselves that it was clever students at Harvard who read the book from the famous economist in England who came up with this plan. No, that's not quite right. That's the revisionist history that's get written later. The reality is it was pressure from below. And now, isn't that interesting? Because if you ask why in today's economic crisis, with massive unemployment, massive home foreclosures, massive Americans feeling pinched at every turn economically, why is it we don't have an expansion of Social Security? On the contrary, we're cutting it. Why we don't have a government employment program? We don't even talk about it. The answer is not that somehow Keynesian economics isn't strong. The answer is we don't have a mass movement from below, at least not yet. Occupy Wall Street may be the first step in that process, but we don't have it yet. And that's why we don't have the kind of response from the government that people were able to get in the 1930s. It isn't about Mr. Obama or Mr. Roosevelt, and it certainly isn't about Keynesian economics versus some other kind of economics. What happens in the realm of politics, like what happens in the realms of economic theory, is shaped by what is happening on the ground in the real world of the mass of people as they try to live their lives. Thank you very much for being with me today. We've spent a little extra time on these 2 major questions because so many of your comments have asked us to. This is Economic Update. I'm Richard Wolff. I look forward to being